So we will jump right into it. Leslie, if you'll move to the next slide. I think everyone is pretty familiar with how the photo ID requirement works in North Carolina now, probably from personal experience in voting in 2023 and 2024. But just as a refresher, so you understand the background and where this photo ID application process really comes from. So under the law now in North Carolina, voters show an acceptable ID when they check in at their early voting site or on their election day voting site. And the purpose of that is really just to confirm that the person presenting to vote is the registered voter. So it's just a way of confirming the identity of the individual being presented to vote at the voting location. All the election workers will do is check to see if the picture on the ID reasonably resembles the voter and if the name is the same or very similar to the voter's name in the voter registration record. This ID is not used to prove residency or eligibility to vote or anything like that. It is really just a means of ID confirmation. All right, and next slide. Now, keep in mind, there are options for voters who do not have an ID that they are able to present when they vote. If the voter does not have an acceptable ID, they may complete an ID exception form and then vote with a provisional ballot, or they may vote with a provisional ballot and then return to their County Board of Elections office before Election Day. Or not before election day, but by noon on the third business day after the election to confirm their identity that way. So, you know, it is not a one-time option. There are additional avenues for individuals who may not have their ID with them that day or who may have an acceptable ID at all. All right, next slide. Absentee by mail voters are also required to have a voter ID, so they must include a photocopy of their ID when they return their ballot. Again, a photo ID exception form can be used if a photocopy of the ID is not available, and that will be placed in the ballot container envelope and looked at when the absentee ballot is returned to the Board of Elections office. So that's just a little bit of an overview, background on what these IDs are really used for in the voting process. All right, so our acceptable IDs in North Carolina are plentiful. So a voter can use a North Carolina driver's license or a non-operator's license that's issued by the North Carolina DMV. A US passport or passport card is also acceptable. An active voter ID card that's issued by a county board of elections, and that is an avenue that's available for all registered voters in North Carolina. Out-of-state driver's license can be used in certain circumstances, and then a military ID card or a veteran ID card or tribal enrollment card are all acceptable. And then, of course, what we're gonna and then also an ID card issued by a department, agency, or government entity for public assistance. And then, of course, what we're going to talk about today is specifically the student and employee IDs that are authorized under 163, 166.17 and 163, 166.18. So a student identification card can be used for voting purposes if it is issued by a constituent institution of the University of North Carolina, a community college in North Carolina, or an eligible private post-secondary institution, so private school. An employee ID card can be used if it's issued by a state or local government entity, and that includes charter schools. All right, next slide. So when it comes to, obviously, the employee ID applications, in addition to the student ID cards, our public colleges and public community colleges and public universities all have the option of not only requesting approval of their student ID cards, but also their employee ID cards. So there's really two avenues to bring your IDs issued by your institution before the state board for approval. Again, that is going to be limited to public colleges and public universities. Private colleges and private universities do not have that same option, since the law does require it to come from a government entity. What we are requiring folks to do, though, is it does need to be separate applications. We'll get into that more in a moment here, but it does need to be separate applications for the student ID and the employee ID, because we are operating under different statutory provisions. So we opened up a new application period beginning on February 1st of this year. There were IDs that were previously approved in 2023 and 2024. However, under the law, those approvals all expired on December 31st, 2024. So we are all starting from scratch together as we head into the 2025 and 2026 elections. So an application period has been opened, and we will be receiving applications from eligible institutions until April 1st of this year. Now, in 2023 and 2024, we did offer multiple application periods. It is possible that we will still do that again heading into the 2026 elections. I think that's probably very likely we will do that again heading into the 2026 elections. But really, we do want to encourage eligible institutions to take advantage of the application period available now as much as possible. This is helpful, I think, for getting the word out to your students and to your employees about the available use of these IDs. And we've set a deadline as early as April 1st, 2025, because our hope is we can have the list of approved institutions really in place by May 1st of 2025. So there's plenty of time to update our poll worker and County Board of Elections instructions with the list of eligible IDs, because as hard as it is to believe, we are getting very close to another round of elections. It feels like it just ended, but it will be the 2025 municipal elections here in North Carolina before we know it. All right, Leslie, we can go on to the next slide. All right, so the application process this round looks very similar to what it did in 2023 and 2024 for those of you who applied previously or considered applying previously. For institution student IDs or employee IDs to be approved, again, we must receive that application by April 1st, 2025. It remains a two-part application. So first, we need a signed student identification approval form or employee identification approval form. And then second, we need a digital image of the front and back of the identification card. And both of these documents should be emailed to voterid@ncsbe.gov. Now, for a good number of the institutions, I think, who are on this call and institutions in North Carolina, there is a little bit of an abbreviated process that is available if you were previously approved in 2023 and 2024. And we kind of refer to this as the no change form process. So it is the same form, but there is a box on the form that says no changes. And an eligible institution can check that box and submit the abbreviated form. If it was previously approved by the state board in 2023 or 2024, if the ID was previously approved in those years, if the ID contains an expiration date, and if there have been no changes to the card since approval. So, changes could be things on the back end, so changes to how you process the card, maybe changes to the equipment, or changes to how you go about obtaining a photo of the student to be put on the card, something like that. Or it could be a design change. Maybe your card doesn't look the same way it did in 2023 or 2024. What we're really looking for a no change application is your ID image. And your ID process looks exactly the same as it did in 2023 or 2024. And again, if you are eligible to check that box for no change, then all we need from you is the form. There's obviously no need to submit a new digital image if the digital image has not changed since the last approval. All right, next slide. It is important to remember, especially for new applications, that in completing the approval form, officials must make certain certifications as to the cards issued during the approval period. These same certifications, these are unchanged because the law has not had any changes. But even for those of you who may be looking at the no change process, it's probably a good mental exercise just to go through and read through this list again. And hopefully, if we move to the next slide, you'll be able to see, I know the print's a little small. I did a screen capture here of what those certifications are. So for new requests, the person completing the form will need to certify for all numbers 1 through 8. If the institution is unable to make a certification for any of those numbers, we will be unable to approve the ID. So this is a very important part. We will try to do our best. If you accidentally miss a box, we will reach out right away and try to say, hey, is it your intent to not make this certification, or did a box just get skipped on the form? But I would encourage everybody to read through this again, whether you're a new application or a no change application, just as a good guideline of confirming that there has been no changes and that everything will comply for the ID. Okay, next slide. And again, this is somewhat duplicative of what I've just said, but be sure to check that each box applies in that section. If additional documentation is necessary, some of those boxes will indicate where additional documentation may be necessary. Please do include that additional documentation with your application on the front end, and again, along with the form and with the ID that goes to voter ID at ncsbe.gov. Okay, so this is a very important part, and something we know we had a number of folks struggle with in 2023 and 2024. It is very important that the correct individual sign the approval form. And these are different. This is a little trickier for those public colleges and universities that may be looking at doing both the student and the ID form, because these don't mirror together very well. So you may need different individuals to sign each form. But for a student ID approval form, the form must be signed by the chancellor, the president, or the registrar. For an employee ID form, the form must be signed by the head elected official for the governmental entity, or by the lead human resources employee. I'll be honest, I think we saw many more applications from the lead human resources employee than we did from the elected official. Perfectly fine on that. And I think in some cases, we're seeing a little bit more overlap with that, maybe the president or that may be the chancellor. But very important to make sure you have the right individual who is signing the form. We don't have a lot of flexibility on that because it is statutorily required that these particular officials be the officials who sign the form. Okay. As I mentioned before, we are moving forward to have the approvals in place for this application round, hopefully by May 1st of 2025. Once approved, your ID will remain eligible for use as a voter ID through December 31st, 2026. So applying now does cover you through the next, not only the next municipal election, but the primary and the general election in 2026. Okay, so this is usually the fun part where we start jumping into some of the most frequently asked questions that we do get about the ID cards that may be approved by the State Board of Elections. So for those entities that may not have an expiration date today, if the entity is planning to add an expiration date after April 1st, 2025, so after really the start of the approval period, does that mean that cards issued earlier without an expiration date cannot be used to vote? So our reading of the law is that a student or employee that presents a valid and unexpired ID from an institution whose ID cards are approved will be permitted to vote. So in other words, once we've approved your current ID card going forward, we do read the law to mean that the older ID cards that are in circulation that may not have that ID or that expiration date are still valid for voting as well. So, you know, what we see the law is doing is really requiring that these expiration dates be on the cards going forward. So it's kind of an incentive to make sure that your cards have that expiration date is tying approval to it. But that doesn't mean that all your previous ID cards can't be used as well. So it's sort of the General Assembly's attempt to get everybody on the right track going forward to have an expiration date. But as long as it's expiration date going forward, we will accept for voting purposes both the old and the new cards. Okay. When it comes to the expiration date, what limits apply? There are no limits under the statute. So it is really up to the institution if the card will expire 10, 15, or even 25 years in the future. We do not require a specific date, month, and year. A year in and of itself is sufficient. So if the card indicates that it expires in 2027, we interpret that to mean that the expiration date would be at the end of 27, so December 2027. So December 31st, 2027 would be the interpreted expiration date. A month and a year is fine. You can do a complete date if you choose, of course, but there's not a requirement under the law that there be a day and a month. Okay, so one common thing, and I think we've seen this actually as a regular practice with many community colleges across the state already, but the question has come up whether an entity can meet the statutory requirement for an expiration date by including a sticker with the expiration date on the card, as opposed to having it be part of the printed design. And that is fine. It's okay to include a sticker. That's a great way to move forward if it is challenging for you to do a complete redesign. With new equipment and with going through that entire process. What we would ask is if there is going to be a sticker used to apply an expiration date to the cards going forward, include additional documentation with your application that explains the process that is used to apply the sticker with the expiration date to the card. So in an ideal world, we're going to have a situation where, it's going to be the institution that is applying that sticker as opposed to the individual employee or student. So it's part of sort of that same control process that you will have for issuance of the ID. Okay, we've also gotten questions about electronically embedded expiration dates within cards. So it's our understanding that some institutions may not have an expiration date on the front of the card, but the card may have some coding to it where it will literally just stop working after a given date. Or maybe, it gets programmed a certain way, so it's tied to the student leaving the university or something like that. Our answer is no. A digitally embedded expiration date is not sufficient. What we are looking for is a visible date on the card. So it can be front, it can be back, it can be vertical, it can be horizontal, however you want to do it. But we do want to see that present on a face of the card. Okay, so that goes over some of the most frequently asked questions. I am happy to answer any additional questions you may have about the process or about cards that your university or college may be considering submitting for approval.
Thanks, Lindsay.